On the 9th dawn of the festival, the village holds its breath. Every gaze, young and old, follows a single woman, mysterious, unmoving, her face hidden for 9 days beneath the same white veil. No one knows who she is, where she came from, or what she's hiding, but everyone can feel it in the air. A truth that will change every life in the village is about to be revealed. What sorrow lies behind those eyes? Why won't even the most powerful dare to lift her veil? When a child suddenly bursts into tears and the most respected man in the village freezes as if seeing a ghost, the whole town realizes something unstoppable has begun. Some are willing to risk everything to uncover her secret, but she remains silent, waiting for fate to finally speak her name. Don't miss this story that will break and heal your heart. Subscribe to our channel, hit like, and tell us where you're watching from. Your story begins now. The morning sun cast its golden glow over the cobblestone streets of Edric village as the villagers bustled about, preparing for the traditional 9-day fair that marked the arrival of spring. The air was filled with anticipation, a sweet mixture of excitement and hope that seemed to seep into every corner of the small medieval settlement. Children ran through the streets with unbridled enthusiasm, while merchants carefully arranged their colorful wares on wooden stalls. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, mingling with the earthy scent of horses and the delicate perfume of spring blossoms. Lord Edward Hawthorne, the most respected nobleman in the region, stood at his manor window, watching his servants prepare his carriage for the journey to the village. At 40 years of age, his face bore the dignified lines of experience, yet his piercing blue eyes still held a youthful vigor that commanded respect from all who met his gaze. His strong jawline was accentuated by a neatly trimmed beard, streaked with the first signs of silver that only enhanced his handsome features. As he adjusted the cuffs of his fine linen shirt beneath his richly embroidered doublet, he could not shake the feeling that today would somehow be different. "Father, are you certain I must attend?" His daughter Catherine's voice interrupted his thoughts. At 16, she was the spitting image of her late mother, the same golden hair, the same delicate features. But since Lady Hawthorne's death 3 winters ago, Catherine's eyes had lost their sparkle, replaced by a permanent shadow of melancholy. "Yes, my dear," Edward replied, his deep voice softening as he turned to face her. "The people expect to see us. Besides, a bit of fresh air and merriment might do you good." Catherine sighed, but nodded dutifully, allowing her maid to drape a cloak of deep blue velvet around her shoulders. Edward felt a familiar pang in his heart, the guilt of not knowing how to mend his daughter's broken spirit, the void left by his wife's absence that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. Meanwhile, in the heart of the village, a figure moved through the gathering crowd with an unusual grace that drew eyes from every direction. She was tall for a woman, with the confident stride of someone who knew their worth despite humble circumstances. Her simple linen dress, though worn, was immaculately clean, and her hands, though marked by labor, moved with a refined elegance that seemed at odds with her apparent station as a commoner. But it was the veil, a simple piece of pristine white, a fabric that truly set her apart. It covered her face completely, revealing only glimpses of deep, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond imagining. As she moved through the market, selecting herbs with careful consideration, the villagers parted before her like water around a stone. "Who is she?" whispered Margaret, the baker's wife, to anyone who would listen. 3 days she's been here, and not once has she shown her face." "They say she came from the northern villages," replied Thomas, the blacksmith, his voice lowered conspiratorially. "Appeared out of nowhere, she did, rented old widow Mary's cottage at the edge of the forest." "Well, I don't trust it," hissed Eliza the seamstress, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What honest woman hides her face unless she has something to conceal?" The veiled woman seemed oblivious to the whispers that followed her like shadows, or perhaps she had simply grown accustomed to them. She moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered far worse than village gossip. Children stared openly, their curiosity unchecked by social graces. Young men cast furtive glances her way, drawn by the mystery she presented and the graceful curve of her form beneath her simple garments. Young women watched with a mixture of envy and fascination, wondering what secrets lay behind that impenetrable veil. The morning progressed into afternoon, and the fair reached its peak of activity. Jugglers and minstrels performed in the village square. Merchants hawked exotic spices and fabrics from distant lands, and ale flowed freely from the tavern's barrels. It was into this vibrant scene that Lord Edward Hawthorne's carriage rolled, its polished wood gleaming in the sunlight, the family crest proudly displayed on its door. The crowd parted respectfully as Edward stepped down, his imposing figure commanding immediate attention. He nodded graciously to the villagers who bowed and curtsied in his presence. Catherine followed, her face a careful mask of nobility that barely concealed her inner sadness. "Welcome, my lord." The village elder hurried forward, bowing deeply. "We are honored by your presence at our humble celebration." Edward smiled, the expression warming his stern features. "The honor is mine, Alfred. The Edric Spring Fair is something I look forward to each year." As father and daughter moved through the fair, accepting the greetings and well wishes of the villagers, an inexplicable tension began to build. It was as if the very air had become charged with anticipation, though none could have explained why. And then it happened, the moment when everything changed. The veiled woman had stopped at a flower stall, her slender fingers gently touching a spray of lavender. She stood perhaps 20 paces from where Edward and Catherine were admiring a silversmith's work. A sudden gust of wind swept through the square, carrying the scent of the flowers directly to Catherine. The young girl stiffened, her head turning sharply toward the source of the fragrance. Her eyes widened as they fell upon the veiled figure, and something remarkable happened. Through the thin white fabric, their gazes met across the crowded marketplace. Catherine's breath caught in her throat, her face drained of all color, and her body began to tremble violently. "Catherine!" Edward's voice was sharp with concern as he gripped his daughter's shoulders. "What is it? What's wrong?" But Catherine could not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the veiled woman, who had gone perfectly still, her own posture suggesting shock or recognition. "That face," Catherine finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Behind the veil. I know that face." Edward frowned, following his daughter's gaze to the mysterious woman. "How could you possibly?" "It's impossible," Catherine continued, tears now streaming down her pale cheeks. "It's familiar. So familiar. But it cannot be." By now, a small crowd had gathered around them, concerned murmurs rising as Catherine's distress became more evident. The young girl's knees suddenly buckled, and Edward caught her just before she collapsed entirely. "Someone fetch water," he commanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the confusion. But Catherine was beyond simple remedies. She began to sob uncontrollably, clinging to her father's doublet as she gasped between tears. "I've seen her in my dreams, father. The same eyes, the same, it's her, it's her." The veiled woman took a single step forward, then stopped as if struck by an invisible barrier. Through the thin fabric, Edward could see her eyes. Eyes that seemed to hold a universe of emotion, of pain, of secrets. For a moment, as their gazes locked across the square, Edward felt a jolt of something inexplicable pass through him. It was recognition, but of what, he could not say. It was connection, but to whom or what he could not understand. It was attraction, immediate, powerful, and utterly bewildering. "Who are you?" he found himself asking, though not loudly enough for her to hear across the distance that separated them. The veiled woman took another tentative step forward, then froze as the village watchman moved to block her path. "Stay back," the man warned, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "The Lord's daughter is unwell." The mysterious woman nodded once, then backed away slowly, never taking her eyes from Edward and Catherine. There was something in her posture, a yearning, a hesitation, a profound sadness that struck Edward to his core. As Catherine was carefully helped to a nearby bench, water brought to her lips, Edward found his thoughts consumed not by concern for his daughter, but by an overwhelming curiosity about the woman in the veil. "Who is she?" he asked Alfred, who hovered nearby, clearly distressed by the turn of events. "A stranger, my lord," the elder replied uneasily. "Arrived not 3 days ago. Keeps to herself. No one knows her name or has seen her face." Edward nodded slowly, his eyes still following the white veil as it disappeared into the crowd. "Find out," he said quietly. "Find out everything you can about her." By evening, as Edward's carriage carried him and a now sleeping Catherine back to their manor, the entire village was abuzz with speculation and rumor. The woman in the veil had become the center of everyone's attention. The mysterious figure who had somehow caused the noble's daughter to collapse in tears, who had exchanged an unspoken communication with Lord Hawthorne himself. And as Edward stared out into the darkening countryside, his mind replayed that single moment of connection again and again. There had been something in those eyes, something that called to him, something that seemed to awaken a part of his soul he had thought long dead. It was madness, he knew. She was a commoner, a stranger, possibly even a threat. Yet as he carried his exhausted daughter to her chambers and gently tucked her into bed, he found himself standing at his window, looking out toward the village, toward the edge of the forest, where old Widow Mary's cottage stood. "Who are you?" he whispered into the night. "And why do I feel as though I've been waiting for you all my life?" Miles away, in a small cottage lit by a single candle, the woman finally removed her veil, revealing a face of extraordinary beauty marked by years of hardship and sacrifice. A single tear slid down her cheek as she carefully folded the white fabric and placed it beside a broken medallion, half of a family crest that matched perfectly with the one emblazoned on Lord Hawthorne's carriage. "Soon," she whispered to the darkness, "soon everything will change." Dawn broke over Edric village with unusual tension lingering in the morning mist. The normally peaceful marketplace hummed with whispers and furtive glances as villagers gathered in small clusters, their conversations dominated by a single topic: the mysterious veiled woman who had caused such a stir the previous day. "You say Lady Catherine hasn't stopped weeping since she saw her," Martha, the innkeeper's wife, confided to her circle of friends as they collected water from the village well. Her plump cheeks flushed with the excitement of sharing such dramatic news. "My husband heard from Lord Hawthorne's stable boy that the poor girl was inconsolable all night," added Eleanor, the cooper's wife, leaning in closer, kept mumbling about familiar eyes and impossible things in her sleep. Thomas the blacksmith, his massive arms folded across his chest, shook his head skeptically. "Mark my words, that woman's trouble. No honest person hides their face for days on end." "Perhaps she's disfigured," suggested the kindly baker, flour dusting his beard. "We shouldn't be so quick to judge." "Or perhaps," interjected Widow Higgins, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper, "she's a noblewoman in disguise, fleeing from an arranged marriage." The theories multiplied like wildfire. She was a witch practicing forbidden magic. She was a foreign spy gathering information for an invasion. She was a leper hiding her condition. She was the ghost of Lady Hawthorne herself, returned to haunt the village, each rumor more outlandish than the last, yet each told with absolute conviction. By midday, the veiled woman had transformed from a curious stranger into a figure of both fascination and fear. At Hawthorne Manor, Lord Edward paced the length of his study, his boots wearing a path in the expensive Persian carpet. Sleep had eluded him entirely, his mind consumed by those mysterious eyes he'd glimpsed through the veil, eyes that somehow stirred memories he couldn't quite grasp, like shadows flickering at the edge of his consciousness. "My lord," his steward interrupted, bowing at the doorway, "the physician has left. Lady Catherine is resting comfortably now." Edward nodded, grateful for the news, yet still distracted. "And what of our inquiry?" The steward's expression tightened slightly. "The woman remains an enigma, my lord. She arrived 3 days ago, paid Widow Mary 6 months' rent in advance with silver coins of remarkable quality. She speaks seldom, reveals nothing of her past, and has not once removed her veil in public." Edward's hand unconsciously moved to stroke his beard, a habit when deep in thought. "And she has had no visitors, no correspondence?" "None, my lord. She keeps entirely to herself, though she seems to know the forest paths with unusual familiarity. For a stranger." This detail caught Edward's attention. "The forest paths? Which ones?" "Those leading to the old abbey ruins, my lord. The gamekeeper spotted her gathering herbs there yesterday at dawn." Edward dismissed the steward with a distracted wave, moving to the window that overlooked the distant forest edge. The old abbey ruins, a place he had not visited in 17 years, not since the night of fire and blood that had torn his family apart. A coincidence, surely. It had to be. Yet something deep within him rejected such easy dismissal. "Father," Catherine's voice, weak but determined, interrupted his thoughts. Edward turned to find his daughter standing in the doorway, still in her nightclothes, her face pale, but her eyes clear with purpose. "Catherine, you should be resting," he chided, gently moving to guide her to a chair. "I must see her again," Catherine said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The woman with the veil. There's something I need to understand." Edward studied his daughter's face carefully. Since her mother's death, Catherine had retreated into herself, showing little interest in anything beyond her books and music. Now, for the first time in years, there was a spark of life in her eyes, determination, curiosity, perhaps even hope. "Very well," he found himself agreeing, against his better judgment. "We shall ride to the village tomorrow." In the small cottage at the forest's edge, the veiled woman sat by candlelight, her slender fingers tracing the jagged edge of her broken medallion. Behind the privacy of drawn curtains, her face was uncovered, revealing features of extraordinary beauty, high cheekbones, a delicate nose, and full lips currently pressed into a thin line of concern. But it was her eyes that truly captivated, deep, intelligent eyes that held both wisdom and sorrow beyond her 38 years. Carefully, she rewrapped the medallion in a scrap of silk and tucked it into a hidden pocket sewn into her dress. From beneath her simple bed, she withdrew a wooden box, unlocking it with a key she wore around her neck. Inside lay fragments of a past life, a small portrait miniature, burned at one edge, a pressed flower preserved between pages of parchment, a child's tiny shoe crafted of the finest leather. A tear slipped down her cheek as she touched each item reverently. "Not much longer," she whispered to the empty room. "The time is almost right." The following morning dawned clear and bright, the spring sunshine illuminating the village square, where the fair continued with renewed energy. Lord Edward's arrival with Lady Catherine created an immediate stir, villagers bowing and curtsying as they passed. Edward searched the crowds carefully, looking for that distinctive white veil, trying to ignore the quickening of his pulse at the thought of seeing her again. Catherine walked beside him, her eyes darting anxiously from face to face. "There," Catherine whispered suddenly, clutching her father's arm. "By the herb stall." Edward followed her gaze and felt his breath catch. The veiled woman stood examining bundles of dried lavender, her posture elegant despite her simple attire. Something about the way she moved, the gentle precision of her hands, the proud tilt of her head, spoke of nobility that no humble clothing could disguise. "Stay here," Edward instructed his daughter, then hesitated. "Unless, would you prefer to approach her first?" Catherine shook her head, suddenly fearful. I need a moment." Edward nodded understandingly and began making his way through the crowd. As he approached, the veiled woman became aware of his presence, her body tensing visibly before she turned to face him directly. For a moment, neither spoke. Around them, the market noises seemed to fade into insignificance as they regarded one another, he with unmasked fascination, she hidden behind her immaculate white veil. "My Lord Hawthorne," she finally said, her voice low and melodious with an unmistakable refinement that confirmed Edward's suspicions about her true station. "You honor me with your attention." Edward bowed slightly, protocol overriding his confusion. At her formal address, "I fear we caused you discomfort yesterday. My daughter's reaction was unexpected." Behind the veil, he could see her eyes soften. "How is the young lady? I was concerned for her distress." "Recovering, thank you. She wishes to meet you properly if you would permit it." Edward gestured toward Catherine, who watched them anxiously. From a distance, the veiled woman's hands trembled slightly as she folded them before her. "I would be honored," she replied, her voice carrying an emotion Edward couldn't quite identify. As they walked together toward Catherine, Edward found himself acutely aware of the woman's presence beside him, the subtle scent of lavender that surrounded her, the graceful rhythm of her steps matching his own as if they had walked together countless times before. Catherine curtsied formally as they approached, her eyes wide with nervous anticipation. "My lady," the veiled woman said softly, curtsying in return with perfect form that no common-born woman could have mastered so naturally. I apologize for yesterday," Catherine began haltingly. "I don't understand what came over me." "There is no need for apologies," the woman assured her gently. After a brief hesitation, she extended her hand toward Catherine's face, stopping just short of touching her cheek. "You have your mother's eyes." The statement hung in the air between them, charged with implications neither Edward nor Catherine could fully comprehend. Catherine gasped softly, tears welling in her eyes, though she couldn't have explained why. "You knew my mother?" Edward asked sharply, his heart pounding with sudden urgency. The veiled woman withdrew her hand slowly, turning to face him. "I knew many things once, my lord, some best left unspoken until the proper time." Before Edward could demand clarification, a commotion broke out across the square. Two farmers arguing over a disputed sale, their voices rising to shouts that drew everyone's attention. In that moment of distraction, the veiled woman slipped away, moving with surprising speed through the crowd until she disappeared from view, leaving Edward and Catherine staring after her with identical expressions of bewilderment and longing. "Father," Catherine whispered, clutching his arm with unexpected strength, "I believe she knows the truth about what happened to our family. She knows who I am." Edward covered his daughter's hand with his own, his mind racing with possibilities both wonderful and terrible. "Then we shall discover that truth together." As they returned to their carriage, neither noticed the hooded figure watching from the shadows, nor the signal that passed between this observer and a richly dressed merchant at the edge of the square, a merchant whose ring bore the crest of the Blackthorne family, ancient rivals of the Hawthorns. The game had begun, and the veiled woman had set all the pieces in motion. The third day of the 9-day fair brought with it a gentle rain that washed the village streets clean and left behind a crystalline freshness in the air. Lord Edward Hawthorne stood beneath the sheltering branches of an ancient oak tree, his eyes fixed on the distant cottage at the forest's edge. He had risen before dawn, telling himself it was merely concern for his daughter's well-being that drove him to seek answers from the mysterious veiled woman. Yet as he stood there, heart quickening at the sight of smoke rising from the cottage chimney, he could no longer deny the deeper truth. He was drawn to her in ways that defied rational explanation. "This is madness," he murmured to himself, running a hand through his dark hair, now dampened by the morning mist. "I am lord of these lands, not some lovesick youth." Nevertheless, he found himself walking toward the cottage with determined strides, rehearsing what he would say, how he would demand answers regarding her cryptic comments about Catherine's mother. He would be firm but fair, authoritative yet respectful. He was, after all, a nobleman accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful men. All his carefully considered words evaporated like morning dew when the cottage door opened and she emerged. White veil in place, a woven basket on her arm. She stopped abruptly upon seeing him, her body language registering surprise, then something softer, more welcoming. "Lord Hawthorne," she said, her melodious voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "You are abroad early this morning." Edward inclined his head, suddenly acutely aware of the informal nature of this encounter. "I hoped we might speak privately, away from curious eyes and ears." She hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I was gathering herbs for drying. Perhaps you would accompany me." Without waiting for his response, she set off along a narrow path that wound its way into the forest. Edward followed, noting how confidently she navigated the twisting trail, how at home she seemed among the ancient trees and flowering undergrowth. "You know these woods well for a newcomer," he observed, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. "Some places remain in one's heart long after leaving them," she replied enigmatically, pausing to gather sprigs of wild thyme that grew between exposed roots. Her fingers worked with practiced precision, breaking stems at exactly the right point. Edward watched her movements, entranced by the grace with which she performed even this simple task. "You spoke of my late wife yesterday," he said finally, his voice rougher than intended. "How did you know her?" The veiled woman straightened, facing him directly. Through the thin white fabric, he could see her eyes, deep, expressive eyes that seemed to hold volumes of unspoken truths. "We shared a connection," she said carefully, "but that is a story for another time. Today, I think, is for simpler truths." "And what truths would those be?" Edward asked, finding himself stepping closer to her, drawn by an invisible force. He could neither explain nor resist. "That you walk these woods not merely seeking answers about the past," she said softly, "but because something calls to you in the present." Edward felt his breath catch. How could she know his thoughts so precisely? How could she read him with such clarity when her own face remained hidden from him? "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both sadness and hope. "I am someone who has carried your memory for 17 years, Lord Hawthorne. Someone who has watched from afar as you rebuilt what was broken, raised a daughter alone, shouldered burdens no man should bear without complaint." Her words struck him like physical blows, each one landing with perfect precision against the armor he had built around his heart since his wife's death. Before he could respond, she had turned away, continuing along the path until they reached a small clearing where wild roses grew in unexpected abundance. "Beautiful, aren't they?" she said, kneeling to examine the delicate pink blossoms. "They bloom here each spring, regardless of how harsh the winter has been. Nature's reminder that beauty persists even after great suffering." Edward knelt beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "My wife loved wild roses," he said quietly, surprising himself with the admission. He rarely spoke of Eleanor to anyone, the pain of her loss still too raw even after years. "I know," the veiled woman replied gently. She would gather them for your chambers, arranging them herself rather than leaving the task to servants. Edward stared at her, astonishment written plainly across his features. "How could you possibly know that? It was a private habit, one that even our closest friends were unaware of." The woman's hand trembled slightly as she reached out, her fingers hovering just above his for a moment before she withdrew them. "Some things cannot be explained in words, my lord. Some truths must be felt." They remained in silence for several heartbeats, the forest quiet around them save for birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves. Edward found himself studying what little he could see of her face through the veil. The curve of her cheek, the shape of her lips, the emotion in her eyes that seemed to mirror his own confused longing. "I should escort you back," he said finally, rising to his feet and offering his hand without thinking. She placed her fingers in his palm, and even through the thin fabric of her gloves, Edward felt a jolt of connection that stole his breath. As she stood, a gust of wind caught her skirts, pressing the fabric against her form and revealing the elegant lines of her figure. Clearly that of a woman in her prime, perhaps close to his own age, rather than the young girl he had initially imagined beneath the humble attire. They walked back in comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing against each other, each accidental touch sending ripples of awareness through Edward's body. At the edge of the forest, where the cottage came into view, she paused. "Will you come to the fair tomorrow?" she asked, something vulnerable in her voice that pierced straight to Edward's heart. "Yes," he answered without hesitation. "Catherine wishes to hear the minstrels perform in the afternoon. Perhaps. You would join us?" Her eyes smiled behind the veil. "I would be honored, my lord." The following day, Edward found himself taking unusual care with his appearance, selecting his finest velvet doublet and instructing his valet to trim his beard with particular attention. Catherine noticed, of course, little escaped her observant eyes, but she merely smiled knowingly, her own spirits notably improved since their encounter with the veiled woman. "You like her, don't you, father?" she asked as their carriage rolled toward the village. Edward cleared his throat, uncomfortable with his daughter's perceptiveness. "I find her intriguing." Catherine's smile widened. "As do I. There's something about her, something that feels like home." Her words echoed in Edward's mind as they arrived at the fair, where the veiled woman waited for them beneath a blossoming apple tree. She wore a gown of deep blue today, still simple but of finer quality than her previous attire, and Edward couldn't help but notice how the color complemented what little he could see of her complexion. The afternoon passed in unexpected pleasure as they walked together through the fair, Catherine between them, the three forming a picture of family harmony that drew curious glances from villagers. The veiled woman showed remarkable knowledge of medieval ballads, explaining their historical contexts to Catherine with the expertise of a court scholar. She listened attentively to Edward's observations about local governance, offering insights that revealed a sophisticated understanding of politics rarely found among common folk. As twilight approached and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Catherine grew tired, yawning behind her hand. "Perhaps we should return you to the manor," Edward suggested, concerned for his daughter's stamina. "Could we walk the lady home first?" Catherine asked, clearly reluctant for their time together to end. The veiled woman touched Catherine's cheek gently through her glove. "Your father is right, my dear. A young lady needs her rest." "But we shall see you tomorrow," Catherine pressed, hope evident in her voice. "If your father wishes it," she replied, her gaze shifting to Edward with unspoken question. "I do," he said simply, his voice conveying more than the words themselves. After arranging for Catherine to be taken home in the carriage, Edward offered his arm to the veiled woman, his heart racing as she placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. They walked slowly toward her cottage, the moon rising full and bright above them, bathing the countryside in silver light. "I haven't felt this at peace in years," Edward confessed as they reached her door. "Being with you feels right somehow, as if a piece of myself that was missing has been returned." Behind her veil, he could see her eyes glisten with tears. "And I have dreamed of moments like this through many long, lonely years," she whispered. Moved by emotion he could no longer contain, Edward reached for her hand, raising it gently to his lips. Even through the thin fabric of her glove, he could feel the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor that matched his own inner turmoil. "Whoever you are," he said softly, "whatever secrets you carry, know that you have awakened something in me I thought long dead." She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel her breath through the veil. "And you, Edward Hawthorne, have given me hope when I had none." In that moment, beneath the watching moon and stars, Edward bent forward and pressed his lips gently against hers through the white veil. A kiss, both chaste and profound, separated by the thinnest of barriers, yet charged with the promise of deeper connection to come. When they finally parted, both breathless with emotion, Edward touched her veiled cheek with trembling fingers. "Until tomorrow," he whispered. "Until tomorrow," she echoed, her voice filled with promise. As Edward walked back toward the village, his heart lighter than it had been in years, he failed to notice the shadowy figure watching from the forest edge, a figure whose clenched fists and rigid posture spoke of jealousy and rage that would soon cast a shadow over the blossoming romance. Lady Beatrice Blackthorne's elegant fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished oak of her writing desk as she read the letter for the third time, her sharp eyes narrowing with each line. At 45, she remained a striking woman, her raven hair showing only the faintest threads of silver, her aristocratic features unmarred by time. Power suited her, as did the deep crimson gown that draped her slender form like liquid fire. "So," she murmured to herself, "a mysterious veiled woman has captured Edward Hawthorne's attention." Her painted lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. How very convenient. The door to her private chambers opened, admitting a man dressed in the simple garb of a merchant, though his bearing suggested more dangerous occupations. "My lady," he bowed, keeping his voice low despite their privacy. "I've confirmed the information. The woman arrived 9 days ago, keeps to herself, and wears a white veil at all times." Beatrice rose from her seat with fluid grace, moving to the window that overlooked her extensive gardens. Gardens that had once belonged to the Hawthorne family before the tragic events of 17 years ago had shifted the balance of power in the region. And what of her connection to Edward and his daughter? They've been seen together daily since the fair began. The village is abuzz with gossip. Some say she's bewitched them both. Beatrice's laugh was as cold as winter frost. "Superstitious. Oh, fools! No witchcraft needed when a man has been alone as long as Edward has." She turned to face her spy, eyes glittering with calculation. What of her past? Her identity? The man shifted uncomfortably. "That's where matters grow. Complicated. My lady, I've found no record of her in any nearby village. It's as if she appeared from thin air." "No one appears from thin air, Matthews," Beatrice snapped. "Dig deeper, follow her, watch her cottage at night. I want to know what face hides behind that veil." After dismissing her spy, Beatrice moved to a portrait hanging on the far wall, a family scene showing the previous Lord and Lady Hawthorne with their 2 children. Her fingers traced the painted face of the woman, Eleanor Hawthorne, once her dearest friend before becoming her most bitter rival. "What game is being played here?" she whispered to the painted eyes that seemed to watch her accusingly. And why now, after all these years? Meanwhile, in the private library of Hawthorne Manor, Edward sat surrounded by dusty ledgers and ancient family records, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled from hours of searching. Catherine sat across from him, carefully examining a faded family tree that spanned generations of Hawthorns. "Father, look at this," she said suddenly, pointing to a small notation beside Eleanor's name. Mother had a lady's companion before her marriage, a distant cousin who lived with the family. Isabel was her name. Edward frowned, leaning forward to examine the faded script. "I don't recall your mother ever mentioning an Isabel." "Perhaps because she died in the fire," Catherine suggested quietly. "The same night." She didn't need to finish. Both knew she referred to the night of the peasant uprising 17 years ago, the night that had claimed not only Eleanor's life, but also, supposedly, the life of their second child, a daughter barely a year old. Edward's jaw tightened at the memory. "Check the death records from that period," he instructed, reaching for another volume. For hours they searched, piecing together fragments of the past, names, dates, contradictory accounts of the night that had changed everything. As darkness fell and servants lit candles around them, Edward sat back, rubbing his tired eyes. "Something isn't right," he muttered. "The official account states that Isabel Montague died alongside your mother and sister, yet there's no record of her body being recovered." Catherine looked up sharply. "Just like there was never a body found for your sister," Edward finished, a strange light entering his eyes. "Exactly." The following morning dawned bright and clear, the 5th day of the fair, bringing even larger crowds to Edric Village. Edward and Catherine arrived early, both searching the gathered faces for the now familiar white veil. They found her near the village well, helping an elderly woman fill her water bucket. Edward felt his heart leap at the sight of her, a reaction that both unsettled and exhilarated him. Since their kiss 2 nights before, he had thought of little else, the memory of her lips beneath the thin veil haunting his dreams. "My lord, Lady Catherine," she greeted them with a graceful curtsy as they approached. "You honor me with your company again." "The honor is ours," Edward replied, noting the simple elegance of her attire today, a gown of soft green that reminded him of the forest where they had walked together. Catherine, less concerned with social niceties, spoke directly. "We've been researching our family history and have questions we hope you might answer." The veiled woman's posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly. "I shall help if I can, though I make no promises." They walked together toward a quieter corner of the village square, finding seats on a stone bench beneath a flowering pear tree. Edward noticed how the veiled woman kept one hand always near the hidden pocket of her dress, the same pocket where, he suspected, she kept the mysterious medallion he had glimpsed the night of their first meeting. "What do you know of a woman named Isabel Montague?" he asked directly, watching her reaction carefully. Behind the veil, her eyes widened briefly before she composed herself. "She was Lady Eleanor's companion and distant cousin, a kind woman, devoted to your family." Catherine leaned forward eagerly. "Then you did know my mother?" "I knew of your family," the woman amended carefully. "Stories passed down, history preserved by those who cared to remember." Edward wasn't satisfied. "The records show Isabel Montague died in the fire alongside my wife and daughter, yet her body was never recovered." The veiled woman's hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Not everything written in official records reflects the truth, my lord. Sometimes history is shaped by those who wish certain truths to remain buried." Before Edward could press further, a commotion erupted nearby. A group of young noblemen, clearly deep in their cups despite the early hour, had surrounded a young village girl, their lewd comments and aggressive posturing causing distress. Edward rose immediately, his protective instincts roused, but before he could intervene, a familiar voice cut through the scene. "Well, well, if it isn't Edward Hawthorne, playing the common man among his peasants." Lady Beatrice Blackthorne approached, resplendent in a gown of midnight blue, embroidered with silver thread, her presence commanding immediate attention. Edward inclined his head stiffly. "Lady Blackthorne, an unexpected pleasure." Beatrice's smile was sharp as a blade. "I heard rumors of Edric's charming fair and thought I should see for myself." Her gaze shifted to the veiled woman who had risen to stand beside Edward. "And who might this be? A new protégé?" The contempt in her voice was unmistakable, but the veiled woman stood her ground with remarkable dignity. "A friend," Edward stated firmly, placing himself slightly between the two women. Beatrice's eyes narrowed as she studied what little could be seen of the woman's face behind the veil. "How curious that you hide your face, my dear. One might think you have something to conceal, or something to protect," the veiled woman countered, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from her slender form. Beatrice stepped closer, her smile never reaching her eyes. "I wonder what secrets hide behind that pretty veil. Perhaps we should satisfy our curiosity." With a swift, unexpected motion, she reached out to grasp the edge of the white fabric. Edward moved to intervene, but one of Beatrice's companions, a large man with cold eyes, blocked his path. The veiled woman stepped back quickly, avoiding Beatrice's grasping fingers. "My face is my own, my lady, to reveal when and to whom I choose." Beatrice's expression hardened. "Nothing is truly private in these lands, especially for those who caught the attention of the Hawthorne family. You would do well to remember that." The crowd that had gathered began to murmur uncomfortably, the pleasant atmosphere of the fair dissolving under the weight of the confrontation. Catherine, sensing the danger, stepped forward to take the veiled woman's arm protectively. "Lady Blackthorne," she said with surprising authority for one so young, "you forget yourself. This is a day of celebration, not confrontation." Beatrice's eyebrow arched at the girl's boldness, but before she could respond, Edward spoke, his voice carrying the full weight of his position. "Enough," he said firmly. "Lady Blackthorne, you are welcome at the fair as all are, but I will not tolerate harassment of any kind toward my guests." For a tense moment, it seemed Beatrice might escalate the situation further. Then, with practiced grace, she stepped back and offered a curtsy that somehow managed to be both perfect in form and insulting in execution. "Of course, Lord Hawthorne, far be it from me to disrupt your entertainment." Her gaze lingered once more on the veiled woman, cold calculation evident in her eyes. "We shall meet again, I'm certain." As Beatrice and her entourage departed, Edward turned to the veiled woman, whose composure had remarkably remained intact throughout the confrontation. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, resisting the urge to take her hand in public. "Yes," she replied, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor. "But she is dangerous, Edward. More dangerous than you know." "What does she want with you?" Catherine asked, still holding protectively to the woman's arm. The veiled woman looked toward Beatrice's retreating figure. "What she has always wanted, power over the Hawthorne family and everything they hold dear." Later that afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the village square, Edward escorted the veiled woman back to her cottage, both walking in thoughtful silence. At her door, she turned to him, her posture conveying vulnerability she rarely showed. "Edward," she said softly, "there are things about me, about my past, that I cannot yet reveal even to you. But I promise, when the time is right, you will know everything." He took her gloved hands in his, squeezing them gently. Whatever secrets you carry, they do not change what I feel when I'm with you." Behind the veil he could see her eyes fill with tears. "And what is it that you feel, my lord?" Edward stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Alive. For the first time in 17 years, I feel truly alive." With gentle reverence, he bent to kiss her again through the veil, the thin fabric, both barrier and strange enhancement to the intimacy they shared. When they parted, both breathless with emotion, Edward pressed his forehead against hers. "I will protect you," he vowed softly, "from Beatrice, from anyone who wishes you harm." "Some dangers cannot be fought with sword or title," she replied, her hand coming to rest against his cheek. "Be careful, Edward. Watch over Catherine. The past is stirring, and with it old vengeances." As Edward reluctantly took his leave, neither noticed the figure slipping away from the shadow of nearby trees, Beatrice's spy, who had witnessed their tender exchange with calculating eyes. That night, in her lavish chambers, Beatrice Blackthorne unfolded a yellowed letter, reading by candlelight words written nearly 2 decades earlier. "So it begins," she murmured, feeding the incriminating paper to the flames. "But this time, I shall ensure it ends very differently indeed." The 6th day of the fair brought unexpected rain, heavy drops falling from leaden skies, as if nature itself sensed the tension building in Edric village. Inside Hawthorne Manor, Edward paced the length of his study, pausing occasionally to examine the object that now lay upon his desk, half of a golden medallion, intricately carved with the right side of the Hawthorne family crest. "It was your mother's," he explained to Catherine, who stood watching him with wide, solemn eyes, "given to her on our wedding day, meant to be passed to our firstborn daughter when she came of age." Catherine reached out, her slender fingers hovering above the broken edge. "And the other half?" "Lost," Edward replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Or so I believed all these years." He recalled the moment earlier that morning when, driven by an inexplicable impulse, he had opened the hidden compartment in his wife's jewelry box, a compartment he had avoided since her death. Among the personal treasures lay this broken medallion, its significance suddenly taking on new urgency in light of recent events. "You think she has the other half," Catherine said softly. Not a question, but a statement of understanding. The veiled woman. Edward nodded, memories flooding back of something he had glimpsed during his conversations with the mysterious woman, a flash of gold quickly concealed within the hidden pocket of her dress. "I must know," he said firmly, turning toward the window where rain lashed against the glass. "Whatever truth she holds, whatever connection exists between us, it's time for answers." Despite the downpour, Edward rode to the veiled woman's cottage alone, the medallion secure in an inner pocket of his cloak. The forest path had turned to mud, slowing his progress and giving him unwelcome time to wrestle with his thoughts. What if he was wrong? What if the connection he felt was merely wishful thinking, a lonely widower grasping at phantoms? Yet deeper than doubt ran a current of certainty that defied rational explanation, a bone-deep recognition that had stirred. From the first moment he had glimpsed her eyes through the white veil, the cottage appeared through the curtain of rain, smoke rising defiantly from the chimney. Edward dismounted, securing his horse beneath a sheltering oak before approaching the door. His knuckles had barely grazed the wood when it opened, revealing the veiled woman standing in the warm glow of the hearth fire behind her. "I knew you would come today," she said simply, stepping aside to invite him in. Edward entered, removing his sodden cloak and hanging it near the fire. The cottage interior struck him with its modest elegance, simple furnishings arranged with care, dried herbs hanging from ceiling beams and books, more books than one would expect in a peasant dwelling, lining a small shelf. "We need to talk," he said, turning to face her. She nodded, gesturing toward 2 chairs positioned before the hearth. "Yes, we do." They sat in momentary silence, the crackle of burning logs and the drumming of rain upon the thatched roof, creating a cocoon of intimacy around them. Edward studied what he could see of her face through the veil, the delicate line of her jaw, the curve of her lips, the depth of eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds of unspoken truth. Without preamble, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the broken medallion, placing it on the small table between them. "I believe you have the matching piece to this," he said quietly. Her sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion before she spoke. For a long moment, she remained motionless, staring at the half-medallion as if it might vanish should she look away. 17 years, she whispered finally, her voice thick with emotion. 17 years I've carried my half, wondering if I would ever see its mate again. With trembling fingers, she reached into the hidden pocket of her dress and withdrew her own piece of the medallion. As she placed it beside Edward's, both watched in breathless anticipation as the jagged edges aligned perfectly, the two halves joining to form the complete Hawthorne family crest. "Who are you?" Edward asked, his voice barely audible even in the quiet room. "Truly, who are you?" She raised her gaze to meet his, tears visibly dampening the white fabric of her veil. "You already know, Edward. In your heart, you've known from the moment we met." Edward's hand reached across the table, not to touch the medallion, but to gently take hers. "Tell me. I need to hear it from your lips." The veiled woman's fingers tightened around his, drawing strength from his touch. "I am Isabel Montague, cousin and companion to your Eleanor. I did not die in the fire as the records claim." Edward exhaled slowly, both relieved and confused by her admission. "But why the secrecy? Why hide your face? Why return now, after all these years?" Isabel rose from her chair, moving to stand before the fire, her silhouette outlined by the dancing flames. "The night of the uprising, when the rebels set fire to the East Wing, Eleanor entrusted me with something precious beyond measure, your infant daughter, whom everyone believes perished in the flames." Edward stood so abruptly that his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor. "What are you saying?" Isabel turned to face him, her posture straight with resolve. "Your daughter lives, Edward. I smuggled her to safety that night at Eleanor's desperate plea. I raised her as my own in a village far from here, keeping her safe from those who would have ended the Hawthorne line completely." "My daughter," Edward repeated, his voice breaking on the words. 1,000 emotions warred within him, disbelief, hope, anger, joy, each fighting for dominance as the implications of her revelation crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Where is she? Why isn't she with you?" Isabel stepped closer, close enough that he could see the tears soaking through her veil. "She has been with you all along, Edward. She returned to Edric 9 days ago, wearing a white veil to conceal the truth until she could be certain it was safe to reveal herself." The world seemed to tilt beneath Edward's feet as understanding dawned. Not Isabel, not Eleanor's companion. The woman before him, the woman who had stirred such inexplicable feelings within him, was... "No," he gasped, stepping back in shock. "It cannot be. You cannot be." "Your daughter," she finished gently. "No, Edward, I am not your daughter." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by confusion. "Then who—" "I am Eleanor," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her revelation. "Your wife, Catherine's mother. I did not die that night, though the world believes I did." Edward stared at her, unable to process her words. "Eleanor is dead. I buried her. I mourned her for 17 years. "You buried a body too badly burned to identify," Eleanor corrected softly. "A tragic victim of the fire, yes, but not me. The rebels sought me specifically that night, Edward. They were led by someone who wanted the Hawthorne line extinguished, someone who has built her power on the belief that I perished." "Beatrice," Edward whispered, the pieces suddenly falling into place. Beatrice Blackthorne. Eleanor nodded. Once my dearest friend, until ambition poisoned her heart. She orchestrated the uprising, spreading rumors that turned the peasants against us. When I discovered her treachery, I became a threat she could not allow to live. Edward's mind reeled with implications, memories rearranging themselves to accommodate this new reality. But why return now? Why risk exposure after all this time? Because Catherine is in danger, Eleanor replied, urgency threading her voice. Beatrice has never stopped watching her, waiting for the right moment to eliminate the last Hawthorne heir. When I received word that she was planning to arrange a tragic accident during the spring fair, I knew I could hide no longer. Edward moved toward her, conflicting emotions evident in every line of his face. Remove your veil, he demanded softly. Let me see you. Let me see the truth with my own eyes. Eleanor hesitated, then slowly raised her hands to the fabric that had concealed her identity. I am not the same woman you remember, Edward. Time and hardship have left their marks. Remove it, he repeated, his voice gentle yet insistent. With a single fluid motion, Eleanor lifted the veil away, revealing her face for the first time. Edward's breath caught in his throat. Though 17 years had indeed left their traces, fine lines at the corners of her eyes, a small scar along her left temple, there was no mistaking the beloved features he had memorized in his heart. The same high cheekbones, the same graceful neck, the same expressive eyes that had captivated him from their first meeting. Eleanor, he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. He reached out with trembling fingers to touch her face, tracing the contours as if to convince himself she was real and not some phantom conjured by his longing. Yes, she whispered, leaning into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the sensation. It's me, my love. I've come home. Edward pulled her into his arms then, holding her with the desperate strength of a man who had been drowning for 17 years and finally found solid ground. Eleanor clung to him just as fiercely, her composure finally breaking as sobs shook her slender frame. I never stopped loving you, she cried against his chest. Every day apart was agony, watching you and Catherine from afar, unable to reveal myself for fear of the danger it would bring. It nearly destroyed me. Edward drew back just enough to frame her face with his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. No more hiding, he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. No more separation. Then with reverent tenderness, he lowered his lips to hers, their first true kiss in 17 years, with no veil between them, no secrets to separate them. The kiss deepened as decades of longing and loss transformed into passionate reunion, their bodies remembering what their minds had never forgotten. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Edward rested his forehead against hers. We must tell Catherine, he said softly. Eleanor nodded, though her eyes reflected both anticipation and fear. She has already sensed the truth, I think. That first day at the fair, her tears, her recognition, her heart knew me even if her mind could not accept what her heart was telling her. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle patter, and a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow through the cottage window. Edward took Eleanor's hand, raising it to his lips. Come home with me, he urged. Today, now, let us face whatever comes together, as we should have been all these years. Eleanor's smile, the smile he had believed lost forever, illuminated her face with radiant joy. Yes, she said simply. Take me home, Edward. Take me back to our daughter. As they prepared to leave the cottage, neither noticed the shadowy figure retreating from the window, a figure who had witnessed their reunion and now raced through the rain toward Blackthorne Manor, carrying news that would ignite a fury 17 years in the making. The crystal goblet shattered against the stone wall, red wine splashing like blood across the tapestry depicting the Blackthorn family crest. Lady Beatrice stood with her back to Matthews, her shoulders rigid with barely controlled fury. "Impossible," she hissed, her voice dangerously quiet. "Eleanor Hawthorne is dead. I watched the East Wing burn myself." Matthews, still drenched from his ride through the rain, shifted uncomfortably. "I saw her with my own eyes, my lady. When she removed her veil, there was no mistaking her. Older, yes, but unmistakably Lady Eleanor." Beatrice turned slowly, her face a terrifying mask of calm that belied the storm raging within. "And they plan to return to Hawthorne Manor today, together?" "Yes, my lady." They spoke of revealing everything to young Lady Catherine. Beatrice moved to her writing desk with deliberate steps, unlocking a hidden drawer with a small key she wore around her neck. "Then we have no time to waste." From within the drawer, she withdrew a sealed parchment bearing the royal insignia. "Send riders to these 3 noble houses immediately. Tell them it is time to collect on old debts." As Matthews departed with his urgent mission, Beatrice stared out the window toward Hawthorne lands, her thoughts racing backward through 17 years of careful planning and ruthless execution. "You should have stayed dead, Eleanor," she whispered, to the rain-soaked landscape. For everyone's sake. At Hawthorne Manor, Catherine paced the length of the great hall, pausing occasionally to peer through the windows at the rain-swept grounds. Something had changed. She could feel it in the very air, a shift in the foundations of her world. Her father had ridden out alone hours ago, his expression a mixture of determination and apprehension that had left her both curious and concerned. The sound of hooves on the cobblestone courtyard drew her attention. Catherine hurried to the entrance hall just as the massive oak doors swung open, admitting her father, and beside him a woman without a veil. Catherine stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her throat as she stared at the woman's face. The room seemed to tilt around her as memories, long suppressed, surged forward. A gentle hand brushing her hair, a soft voice singing lullabies. The scent of lavender and honey that even now filled her senses. "Mother," she whispered, the word torn from her lips before conscious thought could intervene. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes swimming with tears, arms outstretched in trembling invitation. "My darling girl," she breathed, "my beautiful Catherine." Catherine stood frozen, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions, joy and disbelief, warring with 17 years of grief and abandonment. "How?" she managed finally. "They told me you died in the fire. We mourned you. We visited your grave every year with flowers. How could you be alive?" Edward moved to stand beside his daughter, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "There is much to explain, Catherine. Perhaps we should sit." In the privacy of Edward's study, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the rain pattering against the windows, Eleanor recounted the events of that terrible night 17 years ago. Catherine listened in stunned silence as the truth unfolded. The betrayal by Beatrice Blackthorne, the orchestrated uprising, the desperate escape through secret passages as flames consumed the East Wing. "I had discovered evidence of Beatrice's treachery," Eleanor explained, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Documents proving she had been embezzling from the royal treasury and blaming it on your father. When confronted, she threatened not only my life but yours as well, Catherine. You were just a child, not yet 2 years old." Edward, who had been allowing Eleanor to tell her story uninterrupted, leaned forward. "Why didn't you come to me? I could have protected you both." Eleanor's smile held infinite sadness. "You were in London, attending the King's Council. Beatrice had timed her move perfectly, ensuring you were far from home when she struck." She reached across to take Catherine's hand. "I had no choice but to flee. If Beatrice believed me dead, you and Catherine would be safe. She wanted the Hawthorne lands and influence, not your lives. At least not immediately. Catherine struggled to process everything she was hearing. But where have you been all these years? Why stay away so long? In the northern provinces initially, then abroad for several years. I established a new identity, always watching from afar, receiving reports from loyal servants who kept me informed of your safety. Eleanor's voice broke slightly. Every birthday, every milestone I missed, it was agony, my darling, but I believed it necessary to keep you safe. And now, Catherine asked, her voice steadier than she felt, why return now and risk everything? Eleanor exchanged a significant look with Edward before continuing. Because Beatrice has finally secured enough political support to move against the last of the Hawthorns legally. I received word that she had petitioned the king to revoke your father's title on grounds of mismanagement. False charges, of course, but backed by powerful allies she's cultivated over the years. Edward nodded grimly. I received notification of the petition just last month, but had no idea Beatrice was behind it. She planned to have the matter settled before the end of the spring fair, Eleanor continued. With your title stripped, Catherine would lose her protection as a noble heir. An accident could then be arranged, leaving no Hawthorne claimants to the estate. Catherine's face paled as understanding dawned. So she could claim it herself through some distant relation or royal favor. Precisely, Eleanor confirmed. I couldn't remain hidden any longer, not with such a threat looming. So I returned, hoping to gather evidence of Beatrice's past crimes before revealing myself. A heavy silence fell over the room as each contemplated the gravity of their situation. Outside, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight struggled through, breaking clouds, casting watery patterns across the polished floor. Catherine rose, suddenly moving to stand before her mother with an unreadable expression. For a tense moment, Eleanor braced herself for rejection, for the anger and hurt that 17 years of absence had surely cultivated. Instead, Catherine slowly sank to her knees, resting her head in her mother's lap as a sob escaped her lips. I dreamed of you, she whispered brokenly. So many nights I dreamed you had come back to us. Eleanor's composure finally shattered completely. She gathered her daughter into her arms, rocking her as she had when Catherine was a toddler, tears flowing freely down both their faces. Edward moved to embrace them both, the family united for the first time in 17 heartbreaking years. Later, as evening shadows lengthened across the grounds of Hawthorne Manor, Edward and Eleanor stood together on the balcony overlooking the estate, their hands intertwined as they watched Catherine walking in the gardens below. She has your strength, Eleanor observed softly, and your kindness. Edward squeezed her hand gently. She has your spirit and intelligence. Every day, I saw you in her and felt both blessed and tormented by the resemblance. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression serious. Edward, we must prepare. Beatrice will not surrender easily when she learns I've returned. The Blackthorns have always been ruthless in pursuit of power. Let her come, Edward replied, a hardness entering his voice that Eleanor had rarely heard. I lost you once to her scheming. I will not lose you again. Eleanor placed her palm against his cheek, her touch infinitely tender. You never truly lost me. Even when we were separated by oceans and years, my heart remained here, with you and Catherine. Edward drew her into his arms, holding her with fierce possessiveness. Tomorrow we ride to London together. The king must hear the truth from your own lips. With you alive and the evidence you've gathered, Beatrice's petition will not only fail, but condemn her. As darkness fell completely, they returned inside, joining Catherine for the first family dinner in 17 years. Servants who had known Eleanor before gasped and wept at her return, loyal retainers who had kept her memory alive through the dark years of her absence. The night deepened, and after Catherine had finally retired to her chambers, reluctant to let her mother out of her sight, Edward and Eleanor found themselves alone in the master suite that had once been theirs together. "It remains unchanged," Eleanor noted, running her fingers along the carved bedpost over the silver-backed brushes still arranged on the dressing table as she had left them nearly 2 decades ago. "I couldn't bear to alter anything," Edward admitted. "The servants thought me mad with grief, preserving your rooms as if you might return any day." His voice roughened with emotion. "It seems my madness was wisdom after all." Eleanor moved into his embrace, their bodies fitting together with the perfect familiarity that time had somehow failed to erase. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered against his chest. "Through every lonely night, every dawn without you, my love only deepened." Edward tilted her face up to his, studying the beloved features now touched by time, yet more precious to him than ever. "And I never stopped searching for you in every face I met, in every crowd I passed through. Some part of me refused to believe you were truly gone." Their lips met in a kiss that began tenderly but quickly ignited with the passion of 17. Years of separation. Hands relearned familiar paths, bodies remembered rhythms long denied as they reclaimed what had been stolen from them by treachery and circumstance. Later, as they lay entwined in the soft glow of candlelight, Eleanor traced the new scars on Edward's body, evidence of battles fought and hardships endured in her absence. "I fear what tomorrow may bring," she confessed quietly. "Beatrice has had years to secure her position, to weave her web of influence. She will not surrender without a fight." Edward kissed her forehead gently. "Then we shall fight, together, as we should have been all along." Outside their window, a shadow moved across the moonlit grounds, one of several dark figures now taking position around Hawthorne Manor, watching and waiting as riders galloped toward Blackthorn lands carrying urgent messages. The pieces were in motion. The final confrontation approached with the inevitability of dawn. Dawn broke over Edric Village with extraordinary brilliance, as if nature itself had conspired to make this 9th and final day of the spring fair the most glorious of all. Villagers emerged from their cottages to find the muddy streets already drying under the warm sun, the previous day's rain leaving behind only a crystalline freshness in the air and dew-sparkled blossoms that perfumed every breath. By mid-morning, the village square teemed with activity. Merchants arranged their finest wares for this last opportunity to profit from the fair, musicians tuned their instruments for the closing festivities, and children darted between stalls, with exuberant energy, savoring their final day of freedom before life returned to its ordinary rhythms. Yet beneath this jovial surface ran an undercurrent of tension. Whispers passed from ear to ear, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Lord Hawthorne had been seen riding through the storm yesterday with a mysterious purpose. The veiled woman had vanished from her cottage. Strange riders had passed through the village at dawn, bearing the Blackthorn insignia. Thomas the blacksmith, whose shop offered a prime view of the main road, was the first to spot the approaching party from Hawthorne Manor. He set down his hammer with a resonant clang that drew the attention of nearby villagers. "They're coming," he announced, wiping soot-stained hands on his leather apron. "And she's with them, without the veil." Word spread like wildfire, and by the time Lord Edward's entourage reached the village outskirts, a crowd had already begun to gather in anticipation. The procession moved with deliberate slowness, Lord Edward at the front, regal upon his midnight stallion, Lady Catherine riding beside him, her youthful face alight with barely contained emotion, and between them, on a white mare adorned with blue ribbons, a woman whose unveiled face caused gasps of recognition from the older villagers. "Lady Eleanor, whispered Martha, the innkeeper's wife, clutching her husband's arm for support. "But she died in the fire. We all attended the funeral." "It cannot be," insisted the elderly miller, squinting through rheumy eyes. "Some trick of resemblance, nothing more." Yet, as the riders drew nearer, even the staunchest skeptics fell silent in astonishment. Though 17 years had passed, there was no mistaking the graceful posture, the kind eyes, the gentle smile that had once made Lady Eleanor Hawthorne beloved throughout the region. As the party reached the village square, Edward dismounted, then helped Eleanor from her horse with tender solicitude. Catherine joined them, standing proudly beside the mother she had mourned for most of her life. The three formed a tableau of family unity that brought tears to many eyes. Edward stepped forward, his commanding presence immediately quieting the murmurs that rippled through the assembled crowd. "Good people of Edric," he began, his deep voice carrying easily across the hushed square. "I come before you today with extraordinary news that some may find difficult to believe, yet it is the truth, as joyous as it is unexpected." He turned to Eleanor, taking her hand in his. "My beloved wife, Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, whom we all believed perished in the tragedy 17 years ago, stands before you, restored to her family by grace and courage beyond measure." A collective gasp rose from the villagers, followed by a cacophony of exclamations and questions. Edward raised his hand for silence, which gradually returned as the initial shock subsided. "I know you have questions," he continued. "How such a miracle could occur, why Lady Eleanor remained hidden for so many years, why she chose this moment to reveal herself. These questions deserve answers, and you shall have them." Eleanor stepped forward then, her dignified bearing commanding respect despite the whispers that continued to ripple through the crowd. "Beloved friends and neighbors," she began, her voice clear and strong, carrying the refined accent that had once charmed royal courts. "I stand before you not as a ghost returned from the grave, but as a woman who was forced into hiding by treachery and threat." Her gaze swept over the assembled faces, recognizing many despite the passage of years. The fire that destroyed the east wing of Hawthorne Manor was no accident, but a calculated attack meant to end my life and destabilize my husband's position. The crowd fell utterly silent now, every ear straining to catch her words as she recounted the events of that terrible night, the discovery of evidence implicating Lady Beatrice Blackthorne in serious crimes, the orchestrated peasant uprising that provided cover for what was essentially an assassination attempt, and her desperate escape. "I remained in hiding not by choice, but from necessity," Eleanor explained, emotion making her voice tremble slightly. "To protect my husband and daughter from further attacks, I allowed the world to believe I had perished. Only when I learned that new threats had arisen against my family did I dare to return, disguised behind a veil until I could be certain it was safe to reveal myself." Catherine moved to stand beside her mother, taking her hand in a gesture of solidarity that brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes. The sight of mother and daughter reunited stirred profound emotion throughout the crowd, even among those still struggling to accept the miraculous revelation. Edward was about to speak again when the thunder of approaching hooves drew all eyes to the far end of the village square. A party of riders appeared, their mounts lathered from hard riding, the Blackthorne banner fluttering ominously above them. At their center rode Lady Beatrice herself, resplendent in a gown of deep purple velvet, her face a mask of cold fury barely contained beneath a veneer of aristocratic composure. The crowd parted hastily to make way as the Blackthorne contingent advanced toward the center of the square, stopping just yards from where the Hawthorne family stood. For a moment, silence reigned as Beatrice and Eleanor faced each other for the first time in 17 years. Former friends turned bitter enemies by ambition and betrayal. "What theatrical performance is this?" Beatrice demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Some impostor paraded before these simple folk, claiming to be a woman long dead. Have you fallen so low, Edward, as to resort to such pathetic deceptions?" Edward stepped protectively closer to Eleanor, his expression hardening. "There is no deception here, Beatrice, save the ones you have perpetrated these many years. Eleanor lives despite your best efforts to ensure otherwise." Beatrice's laugh held no humor, only brittle disdain. "Absurd. I personally identified Eleanor's body after the fire. This woman, whoever she may be, is nothing but a clever fraud dressed in borrowed finery." "Then how do you explain this?" Eleanor asked quietly, reaching into a small pouch at her waist. She withdrew a sealed document, its parchment yellowed with age. "Your own letter, Beatrice, written in your hand, ordering my death and promising payment to those who carried out the deed." The color drained from Beatrice's face, though she quickly mastered her reaction. A forgery, obviously. More evidence of this elaborate charade. But a murmur had begun to spread through the crowd, growing louder as villagers exchanged knowing glances. Many remembered the night of the fire, the convenient absence of Lady Blackthorn's guards, who normally patrolled the area, the suspicious speed with which she had appeared to assist afterward. "There is a simple way to resolve this matter," Edward announced, his voice silencing the growing rumble of conversation. Lady Eleanor Hawthorne wore a distinctive birthmark, a small crescent moon upon her left shoulder, known only to family. "And the closest of confidants." Eleanor met Beatrice's gaze unflinchingly. "You remember it well, don't you, Beatrice? You commented on it often when we were girls bathing in the stream during summer visits." Without waiting for Beatrice's response, Eleanor turned her back to the crowd and lowered her gown, just enough to reveal her shoulder, where the crescent-shaped mark stood out clearly against her fair skin. A collective gasp rose from those closest. "Enough to see," followed by excited confirmation that spread outward through the gathering. As Eleanor readjusted her gown and turned back to face the assembly, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Where there had been doubt and confusion, certainty now took root. Villagers who had known Lady Eleanor in years past began to step forward, affirming her identity with tearful recognition. "It's her, it's truly Lady Eleanor. I'd know those eyes anywhere. The lady has returned to us." Beatrice's composure cracked visibly as the tide of public opinion turned decisively against her. Her eyes darted toward her mounted guards. Calculating, desperate. "Seize that woman," she commanded suddenly. "She is an impostor and a threat to order." But her guards hesitated, unwilling to act against what was clearly becoming the consensus of the entire village. More damning still, several of Beatrice's own retainers exchanged troubled glances, their loyalty visibly wavering in the face of such compelling evidence. Sensing her rapidly deteriorating position, Beatrice made a final desperate gambit. She urged her horse forward, reaching for the document still clutched in Eleanor's hand. "Give me that forgery. I'll not be slandered by—" Edward moved swiftly to intercept her, grasping her horse's bridle with one hand while the other drew the ornate dagger at his belt. "Enough, Beatrice. You have played your games for 17 years. They end today." The square fell silent as Beatrice stared down at the blade, then at Edward's face, hard with righteous anger. After a moment that seemed suspended in time, she straightened in her saddle, her features rearranging into a cold smile. "Very well," she said with artificial lightness. "Let us say, for argument's sake, that this miraculous resurrection is genuine. What then? Do you imagine the king will simply accept your word against mine? That 17 years of loyal service to the crown will be forgotten on the basis of a dubious document and a birthmark." "Not just a document," Eleanor replied steadily. "When I fled, I took with me your complete records. Every transaction, every bribe, every treasonous correspondence with our enemies. They have been safely preserved all these years, awaiting the moment of justice. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Beatrice's face. "You're bluffing," she whispered, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. "Tomorrow we ride. For London," Edward announced, addressing not only Beatrice but the entire assembly. "The king shall hear the full truth and render judgment. Until then, Lady Blackthorn will remain under guard at Hawthorne Manor, not as our enemy, but as our guest, afforded all the dignity her station demands, while justice takes its course." Beatrice's retainers, reading the situation clearly, began to distance themselves from their mistress. The village folk, emboldened by the turning tide, pressed closer, their faces showing the dawning realization that they had witnessed not just a reunion, but the unmasking of a conspiracy that had shaped their lives for nearly 2 decades. As Beatrice was escorted from her horse with firm but respectful hands, her gaze locked with Eleanor's one final time, a look that contained volumes, rage, certainly, but also a flicker of the friendship they had once shared, now corrupted beyond. Redemption by ambition and betrayal. Eleanor turned away first, back to her husband and daughter, back to the family that had been torn apart and now stood reunited before the entire village. Edward's arm encircled her waist, drawing her close against his side, while Catherine leaned, her head on her mother's shoulder, completing the tableau of restoration. As the sun reached its zenith above Edric village, casting its golden light over the extraordinary scene, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the gathered crowd. A celebration not just of Lady Eleanor's miraculous return, but of truth triumphant over deception, of light banishing 17 years of shadow. The white veil that had concealed Eleanor's identity lay forgotten on the ground, a discarded symbol of secrecy no longer needed in the bright clarity of revelation. Summer had transformed the grounds of Hawthorne Manor into a paradise of blooming roses and vibrant greenery. When the royal messenger arrived, his horse lathered from hard riding despite the early morning hour. Servants hurried to assist him as he dismounted in the courtyard, the sealed parchment bearing the king's insignia clutched carefully in his gloved hand. Lord Edward Hawthorne received the messenger in his study, Eleanor at his side, both of them tense with anticipation. 2 months had passed since their journey to London, where Eleanor had presented her evidence against Lady Beatrice Blackthorn before the royal court. 2 months of anxious waiting while the king's investigators verified every document, questioned witnesses, and deliberated on a matter that had shaken the highest echelons of noble society. His Majesty sends his most sincere regards to Lady Eleanor, the messenger announced formally after Edward had broken the seal and examined the document's contents. The royal court has reached its judgment in the matter of Lady Beatrice Blackthorn's crimes against the crown and the Hawthorne family. Edward's expression remained unreadable as he handed the parchment to Eleanor. She scanned the elaborate script, her fingers trembling slightly against the heavy paper. When she looked up, tears glistened in her eyes, but a smile of profound relief illuminated her face. "Justice," she whispered, leaning into her husband's steadying embrace. "After 17 years, finally justice." The news spread quickly throughout the estate and into Edric village beyond. Lady Beatrice had been found guilty of treason, embezzlement, and attempted murder. Her lands and titles were forfeit to the crown, with significant portions to be restored to the Hawthorne family as restitution for their suffering. Beatrice herself had been sentenced not to execution, a mercy granted due to her previous service to the realm, but to permanent exile in a remote convent on the northern coast, where she would live out her days in contemplation of her crimes, far from the power and influence she had coveted so destructively. That evening, the great hall of Hawthorne Manor was filled with light and music for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Villagers and nobility alike had been invited to celebrate not just the verdict, but something far more meaningful: the formal renewal of wedding vows between Lord Edward and Lady Eleanor, witnessed by their daughter Catherine and all who had shared in their extraordinary journey of separation and reunion. Eleanor stood before the assembled guests in a gown of ivory silk embroidered with silver thread, her dark hair adorned with a circlet of summer blossoms. At 48, she possessed a mature beauty that outshone even her youthful radiance, a beauty tempered by suffering yet illuminated by joy reclaimed. Edward, distinguished and handsome at 50, gazed at his wife with unmasked adoration, as if still unable to fully believe the miracle of her return. 17 years ago, he began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the hushed hall. A terrible crime tore apart what God had joined together. Today, we stand before you to affirm that neither time nor treachery, neither distance nor despair could destroy the bond we share. He took Eleanor's hands in his, thumbs gently caressing her fingers. Eleanor, when I believed you lost, I kept living only because a piece of you remained in our daughter. Now that you have returned to us, I pledge to cherish every moment we have been granted, to love you with the fullness of a heart that never stopped beating for you alone. Tears flowed freely down Eleanor's cheeks as she responded, her voice steady despite her emotion. Edward, my beloved, my constant star during the darkest night of separation, I pledge to you my remaining days, my unwavering devotion, my eternal love. What was broken has been made whole. What was lost has been found. She smiled through her tears, the expression radiant with happiness. No veil shall ever again come between us. Only truth, only love, only the precious gift of time reclaimed. As they sealed their renewed vows with a kiss, the assembled guests erupted in cheers and applause. Catherine stepped forward, presenting her parents with a velvet cushion upon which rested the once broken medallion, now expertly mended by the village goldsmith, the Hawthorne family crest restored to wholeness. For generations to come, she said, her young voice clear with emotion, let this stand as testament to our family's endurance through fire and separation, and its ultimate restoration through courage and love. The celebration continued long, into the night, with feasting and dancing that transformed the manor into a scene of jubilation, not witnessed since before the tragedy. Eleanor moved among the guests, exchanging embraces with old friends rediscovered, accepting the heartfelt good wishes of villagers who had once believed her dead. Her joy multiplied by sharing it so openly after years of necessary solitude. As midnight approached, Edward found her standing alone on the terrace, gazing up at the star-filled summer sky. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, drawing her back against his chest in a gesture of protective tenderness that made her sigh with contentment. "What are you thinking, my love?" he murmured, his lips close to her ear. Eleanor leaned into his embrace, covering his hands with her own. "I was counting blessings," she replied softly, "and marveling at how completely joy can replace sorrow, given time and healing." Edward turned her gently to face him, studying her beloved features in the silvery moonlight. "Do you ever think of her?" he asked quietly. "Of Beatrice, and what might have been had ambition not poisoned her heart?" Eleanor's expression softened, with compassion that surprised even herself. "I think of the girl she was, before power became her only passion. I pray she finds peace in her exile, not the peace of forgetting, but the deeper peace that comes from true repentance." Edward shook his head in wonder. "Your capacity for mercy humbles me, Eleanor. After all she took from you, from us." "She took much," Eleanor agreed, placing her palm against his cheek. "But look what remains. You, Catherine, our home, our love. Even 17 years of separation could not destroy these treasures." Her smile held the wisdom born of suffering transcended. In focusing only on what was lost, we risk overlooking what has been preserved and restored. From within the hall, came the sound of Catherine's laughter, bright and uninhibited, mingling with the music and merriment of their guests. The sound drew answering smiles from both parents. "She has blossomed since your return," Edward observed. "It's as if a shadow has lifted from her spirit." "She carries both of us within her," Eleanor replied, her eyes soft with maternal pride. "Your strength, my stubbornness, our shared capacity for love. She will forge her own path now, knowing the full truth of her heritage." As if summoned by their thoughts, Catherine appeared in the terrace doorway, her youthful face flushed with dancing and happiness. "Mother, father," she called, "they're asking for you inside. Everyone wishes to toast the completion of our family's story." Eleanor exchanged a meaningful glance with Edward before extending her hand toward their daughter. "Come, my darling, join us, for this is not an ending but a beginning, not just for us, but for Edric and all who call these lands home." Together, the three returned to the great hall where servants had prepared a final toast to conclude the evening's celebration. Glasses were raised high as Edward, Eleanor, and Catherine stood before their friends and neighbors, a family restored against all odds, their unity a testament to love's enduring power. "To second chances," Edward proposed, his voice carrying clearly above the quieting crowd. "To truth revealed, to justice served, to love that transcends even death's deception." "To family," Catherine added, her young face solemn with the weight of their shared journey. "And to all of you," Eleanor concluded, her gaze sweeping the assembled faces with genuine affection, "who kept faith, who welcomed me home, who helped heal the wounds of 17 years' separation. May the peace we have found spread throughout Edric like ripples in a pond, touching all lives with its healing grace." As autumn approached, transforming the countryside with its golden touch, the changes at Hawthorne Manor and throughout Edric village became the subject of admiring comment throughout the region. Under Eleanor's restored guidance, ancient grievances between noble and common folk were addressed with compassion and practical wisdom. The wealth returned from Blackthorn lands funded improvements to the village, a new mill, expanded granaries, a school where children of all stations could learn to read and write. Most remarkably, perhaps, was the transformation of the East Wing, once destroyed by fire, now rebuilt not as a separate noble quarter, but as a community hall where villagers and nobility alike could gather for important events, bridging the divide that had contributed to the tragedy 17 years before. On a perfect autumn day, as golden leaves drifted down around them, Edward and Eleanor walked hand in hand through the gardens where once they had courted as young lovers. Time had changed them both, silver threading their hair, experience etching fine lines around their eyes. Yet in each other's company, they recaptured the essence of that early love, now deepened by shared suffering and triumphant reunion. "Sometimes," Eleanor confessed, pausing to watch a late butterfly drift between late blooming roses, "I still wake in the night and reach for you, afraid that all this has been a dream, that I remain alone in exile, you and Catherine still lost." "To me," Edward gathered her close, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead, "and I wake sometimes believing you still lie beneath the family monument in the churchyard," he admitted. "Then I feel your warmth beside me, and gratitude overwhelms me anew." Eleanor nestled against him, listening to the steady heartbeat that had remained faithful during their long separation. "We have been granted a rare gift," she murmured, "a second life together, with wisdom to value each moment as the treasure it truly is." Odim, as they continued their walk, village children playing nearby paused to bow and curtsy, their natural respect unmarred by the fear that had once characterized relations between classes. Eleanor smiled and waved, her heart full at this simple evidence of healing spreading beyond their family to encompass the entire community. "This," she said softly to Edward, "is the legacy I wish to leave. Not just restored lands or rebuilt walls, but restored hearts and rebuilt trust between all who call Edric home. Edward squeezed her hand in understanding. Together, he promised, we shall ensure that the veil of prejudice and division falls away just as surely as the veil that once concealed your identity. As twilight approached, they made their way back to the manor where Catherine awaited them with plans for the harvest festival, the first in a new tradition that would honor both noble heritage and common labor. The three sat together before the hearth fire, their conversation flowing, with the easy intimacy of a family made stronger by its broken places mended, its lost time redeemed by love's enduring power. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, witnessing the peace that had finally come to Hawthorne Manor. A peace built not on forgetting the past, but on facing it with courage, not on burying painful truths, but on bringing them into healing light, not on vengeance against enemies, but on creating a world where such enmity could find no fertile ground. The white veil that had once concealed Eleanor's identity now served a new purpose, transformed into a banner that flew above the rebuilt East Wing, emblazoned with both the Hawthorne crest and symbols of Edric Village, a visible reminder that what is broken can be mended, what is hidden can be revealed, and what is lost can, sometimes, miraculously be found again. Sometimes, the greatest courage is not in wielding a sword or conquering a kingdom, but in daring to reveal our true selves, no matter the cost. What would you have done in her place? Would you have kept your secret, afraid of judgment, or stepped forward to reclaim your story and your happiness? As we watched her remove the veil, we saw not only a face, but a lifetime of pain, hope, and longing finally set free. Perhaps her journey reminds us that we all carry invisible veils, fears, regrets, memories that shape who we are. What would happen if, just once, we chose honesty over comfort, love over pride, forgiveness over resentment? The choices we make can heal not only our wounds, but the hearts of those around us. Real strength is found in vulnerability, and true love is built on truth. If this story touched you, let it inspire you to live with a little more courage and compassion. Please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us, what would you have done if you were behind the veil? Your voice matters here.